Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Some New World, Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age. My name is Father Vincent Strand. I am an assistant professor in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America and a fellow at the Institute of Human Ecology, who is the host for today's event. The Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America exists to educate university students to give the Republic her best citizens, to sponsor multidisciplinary academic research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events encouraging conversation between the Academy and the public square. It's my great honor to introduce our guest today, Dr. Peter Harrison, and we'll be speaking about his new book with the same title as our event, Some New World. Professor Harrison is a professorial research fellow at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and a senior research fellow at Oxford's Ian Ramsay Center. He was educated at the University of Queensland and at Yale University, and in 2011 he moved to Queensland from the University of Oxford. At Oxford, he was a member of the faculties of theology and history, a fellow of Harris Manchester College, and director of the Ian Ramsay Center. Professor Harrison has published extensively on the philosophical, scientific, and religious thought of the early modern period, and is interested in secularization theory and historical and contemporary relations between science and religion. He has been a visiting fellow at Oxford, Yale, Princeton, and the University of Chicago, is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, a founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion, and a corresponding member of the International Academy for the History of Science. In 2003, Professor Harrison received a centenary medal for service to Australian society and the humanities in the study of philosophy and religion. In 2011, Professor Harrison delivered the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, and he was awarded a D.Lit by the University of Oxford in 2013 and delivered the Bampton Lectures at Oxford in 2019. From 2015 to 2020, he was an Australian Laureate Fellow. His 12 books include After Science and Religion, which was co-edited with John Milbank and published by Cambridge in 2022, and The Territories of Science and Religion, which was published in 2015 and was the winner of the Aldersgate Prize. And his most recent book, which we're here to discuss tonight, is Some New World, Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age. Professor Harrison, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Great. Look, thanks, Father Strand. It's a pleasure to be here talking about this with you. I'm grateful to the Institute for Human Ecology for the invitation to be here, and a special thanks to John Henry Hobgood for working on the logistics of this to make it possible. So I think the way we're going to proceed is that I'll talk about the book briefly for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have some discussion with you and then Q&A.
That's right. Yes, no, exactly. So for those of us who are joining, we'll have an opportunity at the end for about 15 minutes or so to ask questions. But yes, we'll begin, Professor Harrison, by simply having you speak a bit about this wonderful book you've completed.
Great. Thanks. Well, look, I mean, broadly speaking, this book is about secular modernity and its historical origins. And what I'm attempting to do in this book is to establish, in a way, problematize the broad stance that most of us have in academic institutions in Western modernity, which I characterize simply by calling it naturalism. And naturalism understood here in a very simple sense as a rejection of supernatural entities and powers. So secular naturalism, that the version of secular naturalism that I'm addressing in the book, entails a rejection of belief in the supernatural. And the two ways in which I kind of address this question of modern secular naturalism is, first of all, to look at the concepts that underlie how naturalism understands itself. And the two key concepts are, most obviously, I think, a notion of a natural supernatural distinction. You can't get naturalism off the ground without that distinction. And the second one is this notion of belief, that religion is understood as belief in the supernatural. So the book looks at these two conceptions, and what it shows is that our natural supernatural distinction is relatively recent, historically speaking. Essentially, I would date it back to the early modern period, roughly the 17th century, although it develops from then on. And our conception of belief, understood as giving assent to propositions or agreeing with certain propositional truths, that's also very modern, again dating from the early modern period. So part of the argument of the book is that it makes a difference that these conceptions that we tend to regard as kind of universal and obvious actually have a history, and that they're recent, and that they're quite culturally specific. Viewed in the broad context, then, we might say that Western secular modernity has taken something of a very idiosyncratic turn
Mhm.
compared with our own deep history and compared with other cultures. And the question then, I think, is given this kind of exceptional historical turn, how would we justify holding what are historically quite odd positions in relation to a natural supernatural distinction and a particular conception of belief? And I think the answer here is that our confidence in naturalism and its underlying conceptions relies on a historical narrative about this progress, and that notion of progress, this historical narrative, then vindicates the exceptional nature of the positions that we presently hold. So the second part of the book then looks at how we developed this historical sensibility that leads us to lend credibility to the contingent historical conceptions of belief in the supernatural. And in essence, what I want to argue in the book is that our historical understandings are essentially mythologies. Now that so that, summing it up, then contemporary naturalistic outlook is underpinned by two problematic conceptions, belief and the supernatural, along with a historical mythology that tends to vindicate or lend support to these conceptions. So that's the overall pattern. And it might help if I just go through the structure of the book,
Mhm.
just saying in a little bit more detail how the argument develops. So the first chapters of the book deal with the concept histories, and the second half of the book deals with the development of the historical mythologies that vindicate those. So the very first chapter looks at our conception of faith or belief, and I use that combination because the relevant New Testament word is pistis, um, which essentially is typically translated faith, but it's occasionally rendered belief in some English translations of the New Testament. When we look at the meanings of pistis in the New Testament context, it's clear that the primary sense is that of trust rather than of giving assent to propositions. Okay, and this, I think, is reasonably well established in the New Testament literature. Now, I don't mean by that faith has no propositional content, all right? Because the fact that you have trust, say trust, if you understand belief, or faith as trust in God, obviously there needs to be a God who exists, and there's a propositional content to that. But the primary sense is that of trust, and we get a development in the medieval period, particularly in relation to more abstruse theological concepts. If you think about the relational predicates of the Trinity as they're set out in the Nicene Creed, these are actually quite difficult to conceptualize. So we get a development in the early modern period of a notion of implicit faith. And implicit faith suggests that the laity can't be expected to have a full knowledge of the meanings of all of the propositions of theology. That's just simply impractical. So that the faith that they have is a kind of faith in the magisterium of the church, or the biblical documents, that these express the content of faith adequately. And so again, we have a notion of trust where belief is kind of socially distributed across the church, as it were. Implicit faith also gives us an account of, you know, the patriarchs who lived before the time of Christ, and clearly they couldn't have had a propositional knowledge of notions of the Trinity and so on, or the incarnation. So implicit faith also deals with that issue. Okay, Protestant Reformation comes along. Protestants are not crazy about this notion of implicit belief, and Protestants insist that people have a knowledge of the propositions and understand the reasons for why they believe them. And this is a classic critique of Catholicism issued by the Protestants. And I argue in the book that this then brings about a change in what belief itself consists in. No longer can it be simply trust in the magisterium of the church. People have to understand the content of their belief, and belief then begins to shift to something more propositional. This then leads to, again, I argue, a modern notion that beliefs require justification. And this is known in philosophical circles as the ethics of belief.
Mhm.
We have an obligation to have reasons and justifications for the propositions that we assent to in matters of belief. And indeed, we get a philosophical apparatus then that builds around religious belief, a natural theology, if you like it, or a philosophy of religion that says, here are the grounds and reasons for holding to these propositions. So in chapter 4, which is the kind of the middle chapter, I then consider the status of arguments for God's existence. And the simple argument of this chapter is that the purpose of these exercises changes in the early modern period. Clearly, we have the famous 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas, typically understood as arguments for God's existence. We have Anselm's so-called ontological argument. What I suggest in the book is that these exercises, and Bonaventure also has a number of arguments for God's existence as we now think of them. What I argue in the book is that these are better understood as kind of forms of spiritual exercise than establishing the existence of God from some notion of a neutral, independent reason. I won't go any further, but I'll just say that that's the nature of the argument. Then the subsequent chapters are to do with sorry, I haven't got to the supernatural yet. Yes, supernatural as a new conception. Henri de Lubac did all of the groundwork on this in the 20th century, and his classic work, Sur Naturel, shows that we don't even really have, in the Latin literature, we don't really even have a word for supernatural until the 13th century, when it starts to appear in Aquinas. And my suggestion is that a natural supernatural distinction as such doesn't really get underway until the early modern period, partly in relation to debates around pure nature, which, as you know, are rather complicated and can be difficult to follow. But I think de Lubac was on the right track here, that something important happened at this time with these new conceptions of a particular notion of nature and a notion of the supernatural. And in essence, I think what happens is that nature takes on a kind of independence from the supernatural at this time, such that if there are supernatural events, they are incursions into what's essentially an independent, self-sufficient natural order. And I think that's quite a new conception. And obviously, this is a conception that works well also for the emergence of natural science, which I think is why we have the natural sciences emerging at this time. But look, in essence, the point here is that our idea of a natural supernatural distinction is not culturally universal. We don't find it in other cultures. Just as interestingly, we don't find conceptions of belief in many traditional cultures either. So something quite distinctive happens at this time with this natural supernatural distinction. Now, the rest of the book then is essentially devoted to stories about history, and which are essentially stories that vindicate the holding of these particular conceptions. Um, I think, um, one way to think about this again is in terms of how the Protestant Reformation critiques Catholic notions of miracles. And the Protestants, of course, believed in miracles. There's no problem there, but they did not believe in contemporary Catholic miracles. And what this necessitated was a division of history into a period where there were genuine miracles, and that's essentially the first centuries of the church. But then there's a notion that miracles stopped, and that all putative miracles after that were fraudulent. And of course, these were fraudulent Catholic miracles used that on the Protestant account, Catholics used to vindicate their own particular claims, and Protestants denied this. So Protestants then divide history into a period where you have legitimate miracles and then you have illegitimate miracles. And also, Protestants wanted to argue that the Protestant Reformation heralded a new age when superstition had come to an end. So superstition characterized papism or Catholicism, and Protestants, with their insistence on explicit belief, represent in their own lights and their own understanding of the shape of history. The Protestant Reformation represents a new phase that ends superstition. We no longer have these fraudulent miracles. And my argument is that when Enlightenment thinkers come along in the 18th century, they simply secularize this Protestant narrative and generalize it. And so they say, yes, there was a period when there were miracles, and those miracles were fraudulent and false as well. And so, and that the Enlightenment then becomes the period that represents this kind of rational, this period of when people become rationally independent and start to provide proper sets of justifications for what it is that they believe. And I guess the other thing we can say is that part of this then leads to a construction of history where philosophy is now understood in a new light and science itself is understood in a new light. So philosophy is understood as a rational rejection of belief in the supernatural. It's associated with naturalism. That's a story we get about a history of philosophy that begins with the pre-Socratic philosophers whose work is characterized by a rejection of theistic explanations. And what I suggest in the book is that this is completely mistaken. This is legitimately a mythological construction. And science and religion also are constructed in history as in opposition to each other, which again I think is completely false. In fact, the basis of scientific explanation is that there is a theistic grounding to the regularities of the natural order, and that appears as a notion of laws of nature in the 17th century, and divinely originating laws of nature in the 19th century are simply secularized and understood as just nature. But that's just a switching of the valence to what was a deeply theological understanding of nature. Okay, so then, I mean, wrapping things up, I mean, what I do in the final parts of the book is to compare this story to some of the other modernity stories. And clearly, I think this account has something in common with Charles Taylor's version of events. But also, I think with Alistair MacIntyre's analysis of what happens in moral philosophy, and to some extent with the so-called decline stories of John Milbank and Brad Gregory, although both of them reject that label, and in a sense, I would reject that from my own account as well. So I think that's broadly where we're at with the book, Father Strand.
Thank you very much, Professor Harrison. That's very helpful, and I think especially for our viewers who perhaps have not read the book, it really gave a very clear idea of some of the main arguments. I think I'd like to start by exploring a little bit more the question of the supernatural and its development and its consequences. It seems to me that well, two things. One is, as you note very clearly in the book, that Christianity got along quite well for a long time without the supernatural as an operational category. What also strikes me, however, is that not only when it appears in the medieval period, how it really transitioned and comes to mean something radically different by the 19th, 20th century than it does with those 13th century thinkers who rely on it. And you bring this out a little bit when you talk about how, for St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, the supernatural has to do mostly with the human person and what is natural for the human person or what is beyond the capacities of the human person. I mention that because when we see the supernatural in these medieval thinkers, or even in contemporary theological discussions, um, the natural supernatural divide is not about an empty space of the divine on one side versus God's action on the other, which would be supernatural. But you talk about and you quote a number of people now where basically anything that has to do with God, the divine, that is in the supernatural. Whereas for the medievals, God acts naturally and God acts supernaturally. I'm wondering if you could just comment a bit more on that part of the move of regarding God's action as pushing that into this supernatural category, as opposed to understanding God as also a natural cause, efficient cause, and final cause within the world.
Yeah. Yeah, look, that's an excellent point, Vincent, and I think, that here's the general point that when we trace word histories, that really tells us something important, right? So when the word supernatural starts to begin it's when it starts to be used for the first time in the Latin West, that actually signals something important. But at the same time, we shouldn't assume that there's a constant meaning of the
That's
supernatural
right.
from that period right to the present. So we need to be a little bit more subtle with our word histories and simply say, "Oh, well, this is where it all happens." And you're exactly right to say, even though Aquinas, and I think it's in Aquinas that we really start to see that this term supernatural used with some frequency, it doesn't mean a kind of two-tiered. Aquinas is not referring to a distinctive two-tiered reality. Rather, he's referring to, as you say, different modes of divine action. And so God acts in along with natural causes, and when he acts outside of the capacities in things or human capacities themselves, that's the context in which Aquinas will talk about supernatural. Now, why I think the early modern period is a key point of change is that at this time, and this is what the new sciences are premised on, there's a rejection of the notion that things have their own inherent capacities.
Mhm.
And what follows from that, there's a rejection of the fourfold Aristotelian understandings of causation. And what happens is that the four Aristotelian causes of, material, efficient, formal, and final really collapse into efficient
Mhm.
causality. And what happens as a consequence of this is that God's causal operations can only be understood as happening at one level. So this kind of flattening of causality um, really changes how you must understand divine action, because God can't be acting in these different modes in different ways. So, and the most conspicuous instance of this then is in the notion of laws of nature and the development in the early modern period of occasionalism, and occasionalism that says actually not merely are these three Aristotelian causes, material, formal, and final, gone, efficient causation essentially
Mhm.
is gone as well. And the only thing happening in the world is that God is doing all the stuff. And that flattening of causality into a single layer makes it possible in the 19th century for that single layer of causal order to be just simply
Yeah.
redescribed as natural. And
Yeah.
and that's why I think the natural supernatural distinction means something quite different, because the conception of nature has changed, and it's the rejection of that fairly rich Aristotelian understanding of the different kinds of causes that leads to this different conception of nature and therefore a very different understanding of the supernatural. And in that latter context, the question about how God operates in the natural world becomes problematic in a way that it wasn't problematic before.
Mhm. Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Um, I have another question, which is actually just kind of a prompt to ask you to speak a little bit more about a part of the book that I found very fascinating, um, which is your discussions for the arguments for the existence of God. You spend quite a while on the consensus gentium argument. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that for our viewers and how you see that argument playing and what happened with that argument. Because I've taught arguments for the existence of God and fundamental theology. I taught philosophy to high schoolers once upon a day, and we would talk about the classic cosmological, ontological, teleological, but this consensus gentium argument that you spend a while on was a bit new for me. So if you'd say a little on that, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, look, I mean, I think this is really a helpful way into seeing some important changes that happened in the early modern period. But if you look at what people say in the 17th century about arguments for the existence of God, very high on their list of arguments is this argument from the consensus gentium, as you say, which is the universal consent. And the idea here is that everyone has an innate conception of God, right? That this is a cultural constant, and this is an idea you find in the Stoics. You find it repeated in Calvin's notion of the sensus divinitatis, and Calvin explicitly references Cicero, for example. And as I say, what's interesting in the 17th century is that everyone rates this as an argument, and many say it's the most important argument and the most fundamental argument of all. Now it's completely, as you say, it's completely disappeared
Mhm.
from philosophy of religion 101.
Right.
What do you get there? You get the three classic arguments for the existence of God. Now, my claim in the book is that this is actually owing to Immanuel Kant's classification of the proofs, and we've inherited that tripartite notion. There are three arguments for this, and consensus gentium doesn't get a look in. So the question then is, well, what this was the, as one commented, this was the most popular and most common argument for God's existence. What happened to it? Well, in essence, I think um, it's as in many things in history, it's overdetermined. So one part of the story is a critique on innate ideas, which famously associate with John Locke. Um, but there's also then anthropological data that's problematic. But Pierre Bayle and John Locke would
Mhm.
argue, no, there are nations of atheists. Now, I'm not sure about that statistical evidence, but at the time, it was regarded as at least plausible. So these count against the argument. But really, I think many people thought that it wasn't an argument at all. It was just a kind of a questionable anthropological assertion. But why? Again, looking back at its history, the reason it was thought to be so persuasive is that belief in God was thought to be, in one sense, axiomatic, that it was built into our reasoning in much the same way that the principle of contradiction is built into our reasoning. And in that way, it was kind of thought to be foundational to everything else. And this, I think, also chimes in with Charles Taylor's observation about, belief in God wasn't an option in a pre-modern age. It was part of the atmosphere that people breathed. It wasn't something that you thought about as a questionable proposition. So the change of status, the disappearance of this argument from the roster of arguments for God's existence, and the questioning of its plausibility and whether it counted as an argument at all, signified this shift to very different understanding of how beliefs are to be justified, and also calls into question the anthropological premise that belief in God or something like that is a universal constant, which I think something like commitment to, as we would say, the supernatural is in fact. I think there's something to the argument as a kind of side thing. I think
Mhm.
actually there is something to the argument, but but you're right that it does signify a very significant shift.
And you note as well, I think it's helpful as you present it with Taylor about the conditions of the possibility of belief, but you also indicate at one point, I thought this was rather insightful, how it shifts the burdens of belief from unbelievers to believers. Now believers are in the place where they have to somehow demonstrate, they have to somehow provide evidence, whereas previously it seemed it would be more that unbelievers would have to do something along these lines.
Yeah, and I think that that's what the birth of what I regard as a kind of new version of natural theology at this time signifies. But it's interesting if you look at, say, if you look at what are supposed to be apologetic exercises, say the Boyle lectures that Robert Boyle initiates that are about refuting atheists and so on. Many of the arguments set out in these Boyle lectures are really about, as one of the Boyle lecturers put it, the folly and unreasonableness of atheism. So that the argument starts as atheism is really a form of deep irrationalism. Okay, but what you the consequence of having these arguments at all is the notion that there is a neutral ground, a neutral rational ground upon which you can debate these things. And the neutral position is that we assume that God doesn't exist, and this is something that has to be proven. Whereas, and your point is exactly right. In the past, it was that the assumption was that God was an obvious aspect of reality, and that anyone who demurred from that had a lot of work to do to establish
Mhm.
that rationally, and it's that the shifts. And it, my argument again is partly that these exercises, the apologetic use of arguments, is part of what makes this actually change. And as someone said, no one really thought to question the existence of God until the Boy lecturers set out to prove it. So that you've got a
Right.
different kind of, it's a different ball game now.
Right. Right. Professor Harrison, the Reformation comes up in your book, The Protestant Reformation, in many different chapters in many different ways. I was struck, I just noticed a day or two ago that Peter Leithart on First Things had written a review of your book. I'm not sure if you read it or not, but what struck me particularly was the title of it, which is "We Are All Protestants Now." He was playing, I think, on a quote you had from Sellers at one point, "We're all naturalists now." What Leithart was getting at there, I think, was some of the ideas of moving away from implicit faith and that it wouldn't be desirable to in other words, to have an ethics of belief where we have to have some evidence this is a desirable state to be in. That, though, prompted me, that title in particular, to ask, what do you see as the main effects of the Protestant Reformation on the questions of belief and the supernatural? These really two things that you're carrying out in this book. What are kind of the main things that you want your people listening to know, in your opinion?
Yeah. Look, I think, let me borrow from Brad Gregory's terminology here. There are lots of aspects of modernity that are unintended consequences of what the reformers were up to. So I think it's important, first of all, to understand that historically speaking, um, you know, these movements like Protestant Reformation have consequences that were never foreseen and certainly not intended by the relevant agents. And I think, so that's one thing to be said. The second thing to be said is, of course, the Protestants are originally Catholics, right?
Mhm.
So their formation is Catholic, particularly in the case of Luther. So that the ideas that Luther is bringing to the table are not in a sense alien. They're not coming from anywhere else but the tradition itself, and that's the very notion of what counts as a Reformation. And I think following on from that, of course, we get the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter Reformation, as it's often referred to. So Catholicism itself responds with its own reform movements, and a classic example would be on this question of implicit faith. I think Catholicism says, well, actually, no, we need to start educating the clergy. We need to start educating laity. So they take on board, to some extent, this notion of ethics of belief. So the Protestant Reformation changes things, I think, for everyone, but it does have this set of unintended consequences. And again, I've argued that, there's something to the notion that Protestantism allows science to develop in a particular way, um, and you know, Protestants adopt a voluntaristic approach to things, which I think is much more hospitable to science. So and on the ethics of belief, which is to say, we need to have reasons for our beliefs. Yeah, I think that is very much a part of modernity. And when you look at the constructions of, if you look, say, at Hegel's understanding of history, which is not altogether straightforward, but Hegel and many of his contemporaries attributed a special place for the Protestant Reformation
Mm.
in giving in the development of the notion of rational autonomy as a kind of priority, and that's for better, for better or worse. And I think I did read Peter Lightheart's review, and he argued, well, you know, would we really want to be going back to something like implicit faith? And he's saying, well, no, I'm not so sure. I actually think that implicit faith is far more common than we give it credit, and certainly the sciences relied heavily on notions of implicit faith, and I don't think there's any way around the fact that our beliefs, we cannot justify all of our beliefs. We must be part of a community, and that's as true for the sciences as it is for religious communities.
On that point, I wondered, as I was reading, if there's a way in which in modernity and in our contemporary moment that implicit faith is even more present in the sciences and other branches of knowledge, simply by the fact that we can't know everything. The amount of knowledge that's out there just keeps growing and growing, the amount of information. And so we have to rely on authority, perhaps even more than once upon a time when people could really master many, many different fields.
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely right. That, the proliferation of knowledge, the hyper specialization that's involved in the modern sciences, because it's such a well organized operation. There's so many people involved, but the whole ecosystem relies on implicit faith. Yep.
Mhm. I have one more question I'm going to ask, but before I do, I'm going to invite our viewers again to submit questions that they might have for Dr. Harrison in the Q&A box. Um, but my at least final question for the moment, Dr. Harrison, is at the end of your book, and in this book in which you do so many different things, it's such a range of historical periods, of disciplines, of figures, very impressively done, but as you admit at the end, one can't do everything. And you say that one of the things you couldn't quite get to is exploring a bit more some of the contemporary implications of the analysis. You mentioned specifically perhaps for cross-cultural understandings. I wonder if you might share a little bit about what you think some of those contemporary implications are from this very impressive analysis from so much history that you've given us.
Yeah. Look, thanks, Vincent. Yeah. Look, I think there's a number of things. One is the cross cultural, and the other is, I think, how we deal with one obvious how we deal with putative miracles in the present. And just recently, I had a very interesting discussion with Carlos Ayer, the Yale historian, who's written this
Mhm.
wonderful book called "They Flew" about
Right, yes.
instances of levitation and bilocation. Now, his point as a historian is that when we look at these miracle reports, essentially, what the professional historian does is they bracket the truth question, and they bracket the question of whether this happened, and they simply say, well, this is what people at the time said. Now, the argument that forcefully comes through, I think, in his work, and it's an implication of mine as well, is that if we're serious about the weight of evidence, and this goes back to Hume's, this is what I think is Hume's problem with miracles. We're serious about the weight of evidence. We have to concede that the weight of evidence for miraculous happenings in the past is enormous. And I think given that, it's a bit of a cop out simply
Mm.
to say, well, I'm just not going to ask the question about whether this happened. Now, at the same time, I think, and again, this is Hume's puzzlement. We don't seem to live in a world where miracles happen in that way anymore. And this, to some extent, this is a Protestant cessation of miracles question. So that seems to me, I can't square that. I can't square that circle. And part of it, in the final chapter of the book, I attempted to somehow address it, to say, well, because we're not expecting to see these things, we don't see them, and so on, or we naturalize the miraculous. But so one aspect is to do with what we do with both our understanding of past miracles and contemporary miracles, and that I think has implications for how we do history. Okay,
Mm.
whether methodological naturalism is the right mode to do history. And I wouldn't go as far as to ask that question in the sciences, but people like Alvin Plantinga have asked that
Mhm.
question. They thought, if you believe in God, should you exclude that from your causal repertoire when you do the sciences? I do think that's worth asking, even though um, this invites accusations of intelligent design and so on, which I think is a deeply problematic approach. But anyway, so that's one aspect of it, and the other is the one that you raised, which is about um, looking at other cultures. And I think if you think about moves in the present to decolonize the curriculum, certainly in my country, for example, to start embracing indigenous perspectives, um, you can't actually do that if you're firmly wedded to a naturalistic framework, because that framework is incommensurable with the worldviews of many traditional societies and indigenous peoples. And
Mhm.
the point I just made is it's actually also incommensurable with our own historical past. So, and this again points to the particularity and the contingency of our own commitments to naturalism, which I think have been thrown into question by this history, but also by an understanding now that we need to take seriously the knowledge claims of others, who we've tended to dismiss on the basis of dubious accounts of historical progress, such that their conceptions of the world are primitive and ours are scientific and sophisticated. And I don't think that's good enough. And I think that our own history provides resources for rethinking how we understand the claims made by those in other cultural traditions.
Very good. Thank you. We have a number of questions that have come from our viewers, so I'm going to start with a few of these to Professor Harrison. So here's the first one for you. Is the separation between natural and supernatural related to the separation between nature and grace that our questioner asked that also arose in early modernity?
Yeah. Yes. The short answer. And I think, look, I think, were I a theologian, that I think nature grace distinction would have had a much stronger role, or a much more central place in the book. Although that would have entailed, I think, a serious look at the pure nature debates in the early modern period, which, to be frank, I desperately wanted to avoid. um, and perhaps for reasons you will.
I understand very well. One could get sucked into there and hardly ever emerge again. So
Yeah,
yes,
it's like a black hole.
it is.
So to some extent, this was a deliberate choice. But look, I think the question is a really good one, because if you're taking this issue seriously, the nature grace relation is not something that you can avoid, because it's in a way front and center. And I think my justification for dispensing with it, apart from its complexities and the fact that people are not theologically attuned to understand this in the present. So that was one part of it. But I was more interested in the science aspects of the story, which took us away to some extent. It took us away from the theological question, which I was quite relieved about. But let me say yes, and I think it's extremely complicated, and I'm not sure that we actually have an answer to the question, particularly in relation to human autonomy and free will. And this goes back to Augustine and Pelagius. I'm
That's
not
right.
sure that
Yes.
ever been I'm not sure that's ever been resolved. And it's a very difficult issue is to what human beings, in terms of their natural capacities, can accomplish in relation to questions of salvation and so on, and what is the role played by divine grace.
Mhm.
And I think, there are problems. There are, in my view, obvious problems with a Calvinistic position, and to some extent a purely Augustinian position.
Mhm.
But it's not obvious that it's not obvious. There are problems also with the alternatives, right?
Right.
So
No, that interchange between divine freedom and human freedom is always gonna be one of the thorniest issues for Christian theology.
yeah, yeah. So look, I think so look, your question is exactly right. So this is really theologically, I think it's the central question.
Yes.
And I I must confess that I was not obviously not interested in resolving that question, but I think even attempting to articulate what was at stake was quite difficult in the context of a book where I was going from sort of Plato to NATO.
Yes. Good. Move to a different question here. And our questioner asks, how does your conceptual history bear on understanding non-Western traditions or religions? For example, Confucianism, Buddhism, etc.
Yeah. So look again. This is a good question, and um, here I think the relevant concept is religion. And again, religion is a modern concept that takes on its contemporary meaning in the 17th century. I would argue again, partly as a consequence of the Protestant Reformation. But if you look at the senses of religio in, say, if you look at Aquinas, for example, religio is one of the moral virtues. Okay. And Aquinas will talk about the way in which religio has an internal component related to piety, and it has an external component essentially relating to rites and rituals. Um, in the Middle Ages, religion also will refer to monastic orders. But
Mhm.
in the 17th century, it takes on a completely new conception, and we get world religions. We get a generic conception of religion, and this becomes the frame through which we then start to view Christianity and the very notion of world religions, which is not possible until you get this, you know, this objectified notion of a religion consisting in beliefs and practices. And these beliefs are understood now in this propositional sense. So the reification or the construction of our modern religion is a key part of this story, and it parallels the appearance of our modern conception of religion parallels precisely a new conception of belief and this distinction between the natural and the supernatural. So what I would say in relation to the world religions is that while we continue to conceptualize these as kind of versions of a paradigm that's really based on a modern understanding of Christianity, we're going to struggle, right? And I mean, Confucianism is a classic example. So Confucianism, uh, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the great Canadian uh, scholar of comparative religion, who's written um, very profoundly on this very question, says that whether Confucianism is a religion is a question that the West has never been able to answer, but the Chinese have never been able to ask.
Mhm.
And they've never been able to ask it because they don't have this conception of religion. So again, it's a good question, our modern conception of religion is part of this whole story, and it relates then to this question of so-called comparative religion, where what we the danger is that we attempt to place other traditions in the frame that only develops in the modern West. And also, if when we apply this conception of religion to our own history, it's distorting because it tends to construct Christianity in terms of what did they believe, what did they practice. And my argument in relation to belief is that actually that's not quite the right question to ask, because these things are not distinguished in that way in the tradition.
Mhm. Good. I have another question, which is a bit different, but I think maybe an important one. The question is this: does the growing interest in the UFO phenomenon present a potential supernatural force to change the paradigm of secular culture? If I might extrapolate beyond what our questioner is asking, I mean, many different studies and surveys that show increasing interest in various supernatural or spiritual phenomenon, spiritual realities that seems to be some of this proliferating even more in the last several years. And I think this interest in UFOs is perhaps part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I said, I had this conversation with Carlos Ayer recently, given his discussion of miracles, and what he said is that as a consequence of this recent book of his that suggests we need to take miracle reports more seriously than we have, he's been kind of linked with the UFO gang and the paranormal, and I must confess I feel very nervous about this. Um, because I've always been deeply skeptical about. Frankly, I've always been deeply
Right.
skeptical about this stuff. It just seems implausible to me. But to be honest, I have to say that my own skepticism is really just a mirror of many other people's skepticism about miracle reports. So I think, look, the short answer to the question is I honestly don't know. But I do come back to this point that Carlos makes in his book and his subsequent commentary on it, that really we have to be open to what the empirical evidence shows. And history is, for me, it's an empirical discipline. It's about the nature of the evidence, and we have to
Mhm.
be, so on this question, I would just say there are lots of strange things happen in the world that we don't fully understand, and we need to be open, at least, to assess the evidence. And the evidence may or may not be there for these things. But my own view is that we shouldn't simply, if I'm consistent, we shouldn't simply rule them out of court because it doesn't fit with our own particular understanding of how nature operates.
That's right. No, that seems right. And I think it's not just the potential UFO phenomenon, and I think with you on that, but almost the phenomenon of interest in this and what that's telling us anthropologically about some of these narratives of progress and how we'll just kind of move beyond, and more broadly interest in paranormal, to see these things present. It seems to complicate some of these narratives that you deal with in the book of that this is all of this bygone age and now we're moving into some other future.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would say I just think that rhetorically, it's important that if you're attempting to be persuasive, you don't make it easy for yourself to be dismissed as some
Mm,
kind of, well, frankly, some kind of nutter, right? So it's a balancing act, I think.
right.
Yeah.
Here's one more question. How will the secular West's inadequate categories on belief and supernatural natural dichotomy change and become more adequate? So I think if the questioner, if I'm understanding, if these are inadequate in your argument, how would they become more adequate? And then there's an additional question with this, and that is, will that be from non-Western traditions forcing the secular West to realize its inadequacy, or from an internal reform within the West?
Yeah, look, that's a great question, and it's something I've thought about, and actually some of the reviewers have prompted me to think about this. There's a forthcoming review by James K.A. Smith, who's puts it this way, whether there's some kind of Hegelian um, Aufhebung, some sort of Hegelian synthesis that will overcome this polarized distinction. Um, and to be honest, I don't know. But look, I think that the question about the internal pressures and the external pressures, which relates a little bit to Charles Taylor's notion of cross pressures. I think there's some really interesting internal pressures well, in physics, obviously, quantum mechanics, it seems to suggest that all the bets are off in terms of our common sense understanding of how the world operates. But we've become accustomed to that. We've become habituated to that, and it no longer shocks us. Um, in biology, interestingly, something like teleology seems to be coming back. That
Mm,
biologists are more and more comfortable talking about purpose in a way that they weren't before. So I think, and if you look at the broad history of science, and if you buy into the Kuhnian understanding of paradigmatic revolutions, you might say, well, maybe there's some sort of paradigmatic revolution on the horizon that's driven by these internal pressures and internal complexities that the tradition that the tradition itself throws up. So I think the sources of internal change are one possibility. But within the academy, I think, which has been very strongly and predominantly naturalistic in outlook, if the academy is serious about its interest in cross-cultural traditions, and it seems that it's right that it should be, and it's on the grounds of what we might say epistemic justice, that we don't simply dismiss people's worldviews because we think they're more primitive than ours, then I do think, again, in this way, there are also these external pressures that, together with these internal things, might give rise to some kind of realignment where we move to a post-natural supernatural distinction approach. And I'm so this is something that I'm thinking about, right? So it's a great question in that sense, something I'm thinking about because one of the implications of the book is that okay, we've arrived here at this historical situation. It's problematic for these reasons. Well, what do we do? Do we go back, or is there a way forward? And so these are things I don't have a determined clear view on at the moment, but certainly I think I'm thinking about them.
very good. And maybe with that final comment, that is our inability to entirely predict the future and what's going to come ahead is a good place to stop. I want to thank all of our viewers who've tuned in for this webinar. I want to thank the Institute for Human Ecology for hosting this. And above all, I want to thank Professor Harrison, firstly, for writing this magnificent book, from which I've certainly learned a lot. And I know many of our readers and viewers will do the same. And for giving us very generously of your time. I want to say this evening, but they're in Australia this morning. It's been a real delight to speak with you about this book, and really very very grateful for this opportunity.
Well, look, thank you, Vincent. It's been good chatting with you. There've been terrific questions that from you and from the listeners, and it's given me more to think about and more to work on, maybe for the next book. So, the thanks to you and to the institute and to our listeners.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to that next book and your future work. And once again, we thank everyone for tuning in and wish you a very pleasant evening. Bye now.